Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Fiscal Matters, a podcast of the Financial and Fiscal Commission where we simplify financial and fiscal matters. We also simplify policy issues so that you at home can be able to be informed and to make proper decision when it comes to your civic duties. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Honourable Lechesa Tsenoli, from the South African Parliament, the 6th Parliament. He has been with Parliament since 2014 as a Deputy Speaker. And he's here today with us to engage on various issues as we celebrate 30 years of our democracy. He has been a member of Parliament since 1994, and throughout those years he has made a huge contribution in our democracy. And today we have great pleasure in tapping into his wisdom and knowledge about our democracy and where we have come from in these 30 years of our constitutional democracy. Welcome, Honourable Lechesa Tsenoli.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share this conversation with you about the period you are talking about.
Yes, thank you so much. So I think as a start, for somebody who is at home and who's listening to this conversation with us, you have been a member of Parliament since 1994. And since then, you have served in various roles. Can you describe your path to become a member of Parliament, to become a lawmaker? What influenced you or shaped your political career?
Firstly, one of the things that I credit ultimately to perhaps being spotted in the civic movement was because I read a lot and I got to experience things that were wrong in the country, although with little, with not so much awareness. We used to read, and debating was part of that reading that we used to do a lot. And so I was never happy when I wasn't reading. And my mom used to threaten to throw me out of the kitchen where I was sitting with her and she was talking to me and I would be holding a book reading. She resented it because she wanted to have a conversation. But I'm just citing it as a way in which books attracted me. So that's the one thing that I think it played an important role. It still does today, my reading. But I got into politics because I was spotted by one motor journalist, and he took me to a conference in Welgespreid, which is now being sold, we are told. It used to be a seat of many workshops and political conferences and so on. That one was for writers. I was an aspirant writer at that time, and I was also a contributor to a protest magazine called Staff Rider. We used to distribute it and also contribute poetry in it. It was, in a sense, part of the Black consciousness movement in the country. And so we got to hear about the formation of the student organization on campuses, but I was not a student at the time. In 1976, by the way, to clarify, I often tell people who speak about that period that in 1976 I was already working as a clerk. I had just done my matric the previous year in Kronstadt. Well, not the previous year, the previous 2 years. I did my matric in 1973 and 74 and supplemented in March 1975. So I was already working. I wasn't at school at all, but we were already very alert to what's happening. I love jazz, and there are singers who inspired us big time with their African American jazz and soul singers. Played a very important role in raising awareness of their condition in the United States, but we saw similarities with our own condition. So that's a musical input into the influence. On the one hand, it was my writing was an accident. I met a student that I taught in 1978 at Budibeng High School. I taught for 1 year there. And he asked me what I'm doing now. So I told him, no man, I'm writing. It just came out of my mouth. So when we parted ways, I said, but why did I tell this boy that I'm writing? So on my arrival back to Bloemfontein, I went straight to the Friend newspaper, met with the editor, the Friend newspaper. Had an African guy who was dealing with an African version of that newspaper, and I said to him, look, do you have a job for me as a writer? That's how I started my journalism attempt. And so I used to go out. He said to me, if you can write, go get me a story and come back. I did that and started working there. And I think it was those experiences that then led later for me to be invited by this gentleman to a PAN conference, a conference of writers. And there I met Nadim Godima in debate with Mafika Pascal Gwala from KZN, who was an articulate Marxist, as he calls himself. And it was fascinating to listen to the conversations that were taking place there. But they were crucial in that they also framed how I was to, what I already knew partly, but had not really begun to act on what I knew. And so I ultimately, in 1979, went to Durban from Bloemfontein. Because I was invited, because my dad had told me that his friend had said that there is a job there for a translator from Sesotho to English and vice versa for Bona magazine. And I said, Durban, that's where I'm going to. I don't care what this job is about. Durban was like what everybody spoke about going to for holiday or things like that I used to hear. So here's a chance for me to go and live there. And I went to Durban in that way. When I got to Durban, of course, in the course of translating, including recipes, and so on, I got bored and persuaded them to buy me a camera to Calabant as a photographer as well. But very soon, and I was still distributing Staff Rider magazine. I met at a social function somewhere with people who, after that, one of them pursued me and literally recruited me into the ANC. That was the first formal, in a sense, recruitment that is of a serious nature. because whilst I became part of, although on the periphery, of the Writers Association of South Africa and subsequently MWASA, Media Workers of South Africa, because of my journalism attempts. When I got to Durban, I knew people who we were with in MWASA, and they were in Azapo, in the Black Conscious movement. But I gravitated into what I was recruited into, slowly and over time. Then we started organizing at a local level young people to get involved in matters that relates to their condition, the community in which they lived, and similar things. And that work was crucial in how it then also subsequently linked us with other civic organizers in the Durban functional area, as we called it then. I remember one activist who was a professional social worker who helped us with, we were doing the door-to-door work in an informal manner, and he suggested to us, Norman, what you can do useful things there by doing a deliberate survey. So he drafted questions for us, so which we used when we entered these homes to ask people these questions. The result of those of responses to those questions and the exposure of the young people we were working with into those homes exposed them to levels of poverty they never believed existed, nor had seen it in their own neighborhoods. That's how they were politically, they became aware then via that exposure and became long-term activists as a result. So we played a very important role. Our youth organization in the township in Lamontville became the first such youth organization to be an affiliate of the United Democratic Front. We said the UDF. We were part of the people who set it up. And I started working in the UDF with a friend, Getso Gordon, Praveen Mshana, Praveen Gordon Mshana. We worked with Praveen as well in the structures they were operating in around Durban. That's my, in a sense, slow integration into activism, and that led to us later, because of the work we were doing there, we were one of the most effective youth organizations in Lamontville. So we impacted on other townships around us. We worked with excellent young people also from these other townships around Durban. Finally, I became elected in 1985, I think it was, as a publicity secretary of the UDF in Natal. That was very important, because then I subsequently got elected as a chairperson of what was called International Youth Year program in Natal. And in both capacities, we operated nationally. And so we traveled quite a lot. It exposed us, and we were invited to go to places to create a better awareness, to knit structures together, to work together more and better. And that meant I played an important leadership role. And the person who recruited me incidentally, if I may just talk about him briefly, was a mathematician. I think he had a postgraduate diploma in mathematical modeling. He did it in the USA, but he studied and lectured at UKZN at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Mpangeni and in the campus closest to Durban as well. He loved jazz. That, in fact, is the basis on which he pursued me to come and hear more of what jazz I was playing, because he sang it and played it. And in the course, then chose to hook me into his other political stuff. And what I'm saying in a long story is those processes exposed me to the politics and civic work, consciously working to raise the awareness of communities. For example, we were the ones who started talking about one city, one tax base. But later on, we got our attention was brought to the reality that no, this is nonsense, man. Even if any city or town collected all the revenue they think they can collect from the town, that would never be adequate to deal with the problems of any of those cities. So properly speaking, we are talking about one city, one tax base. One city, one country, one tax base. To broaden it, to say that you deserve, we deserve, in Lamontville, for example, the result of the taxes that were paid to Durban, which was meant to administer only to a few and better services, yet to others very limited services. So that awareness was brought to our attention very dramatically. We learned that no amount of taxes collected in one area would be adequate. We needed as much as possible all the resources that were collected around. One of the old ladies, a veteran of the Women's League in Lamontville, Florence Mkhize, one of the buildings in Durban is named after her, by the way, says to me, Lechesa Mtanam, what can we do with sugarcane and bananas in Natal without the gold and diamonds in the Free State? That was a fascinating elevation of the integratedness of our life in the country, that it couldn't be parceled into small little pieces, and then the people there must make do with whatever they are able to generate wherever they are, and that would be okay. So we needed as much contribution as is appropriate to our situation from the national revenue collected, so to speak. So that lesson I learned in the civic movement.
The civic movement.
Yeah.
So for a young person then, it's important to know that you need to be involved in the ground structures and actually work from the bottom up, addressing people's needs and working with communities. So in your case, Honorable Deputy Speaker, for more than 25 years, your constituency has almost been influenced by your political ideas. Now, when you are an MP and you go to Parliament, you represent a certain constituency. Now, the question I want to ask is, how do you balance now the needs of that constituency that you represent and the needs of your legislative work? So how do you get their input into your legislative work? How do you actually engage your constituency?
Okay. Let me first say this to your earlier first point, that you can come into politics firstly in the course of your, for example, your student work as a student. There are problems the student faces there. If you are helpful, learn to be of assistance to others, and you demonstrate your recognition of your interdependency with others, when occasions arise, people depend on you. They choose you to represent them because you have already demonstrated your ability to represent people properly. That's the first important point. So even if they are not directly involved in civic work in general, but are involved in their neighborhood, just in their neighborhood. For example, this friend of mine, before he died, he introduced chess and got attracted many young people in the neighborhood who were interested in learning about chess and playing it. And so when people ask, why is so-and-so? No, he's there with Bujab, who is playing chess. So even parents got to recognize that this man is keeping our children doing something good. And so he is the one that we would depend on to help work with us on other things. So that was very crucial. When you speak about my constituency, you're complicating my life because firstly, in our country, this elections we are going to vote for on the 29th of May will be the first at a national and provincial level to have an independent candidate who comes from a geographic, constituency. When I was called by the organization to be a member of parliament on its behalf, I was already operating at a national level. I was a deputy president. I became a deputy president in 1992 and had been involved with civic organizing. We were thwarted from creating a national organization of civics in the mid-80s by the state of emergency. So later, when we formed the South African National Civic Organization, our constituency, if we speak about a constituency, was that we were referring to civic organizations in every country. So they had come together to form provincial structures and then formed national structures and elected us into their national leadership. I'm describing this to say to you, so the expectation would be that if you, or when I got a call from Raymond Satner, he was then operating at head office in Shell House, to say that the organization has decided that he must be one of our MPs, so we are sending you to Parliament. So what do you mean? I'm operating in a structure which has blessings of my organization. How can I go there? So I said, no, I'll come back to you. So I wrote a note to civic structures in the country. And some of them wrote back, others just ignored my letter, asking them, telling them that I've been approached by Shell House, and Shell House is asking me to go to Parliament as an MP. What's your view? We've just established this organization, the Civics. 3 of them says to me, almost like they must have caucused it, I suspected. Deputy President, if you don't go there, how are these things we've been talking about going to be implemented if you are not there yourself? So that's what drove me finally to accede and then go to become an MP.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then, if you can explain the process.
So, no, let me do this. Let me explain this, the last part of the question. It is important also then to recognize, but once inside Parliament, the organization, the African National Congress, then decides, okay, you come from this area, our structures in the organization allocates to us a constituency. In this time it is a specified area, like now, my constituency office is in Botshabelo, but my first office was in Gababa. And I shared my constituency with the late Manto Shabalala. She came from the south coast, so that's where my first constituency is. My second one was in Bloemfontein, in Rocklands, in the Temakofane's filling station. My Parliament label of the Constitution still hangs on the building. Yeah, that was my second constituency office. So it's an allocation that is done by the political party.
Yes.
Obviously, over time, for some of them who may choose to become independent, which is a bit of a difficulty, they will have a specific community to go back to speak.
Yes.
So mine is in Botshabelo right now. So I have to balance three things. We have families, okay, and they have demands on us and our time and whatever money we may have. And then I belong to two organizations that expect me to attend the constitutional structure meetings and do work between those meetings, about which I must report to them. But the understanding is that the work we are doing in all of this is on behalf of the people. So interacting with community members, ordinary members, is what you do in between. If I don't do it in Botshabelo, in Mangaung, inside the city there, and or anywhere else in the country, in Lamontville, for example, we have to show in what we contribute in the work of Parliament that their concerns have been taken on board by ourselves, that we supported their whatever they were calling for and so on. So that's how we work to do that.
Okay. I think that's...
And maybe the final point is that because of my writing and love of progressive journalism, I've been publishing a newsletter since September 2019 every month. This morning, just before I called you, I was finishing half of the distribution that I do regularly. So after this, I'm going to have to finish my distribution online of the newspaper. It's going to be printed, and once printed, I have a person who helps me distribute it in my constituency. Oh. So people also see their stories that we write about.
Yes.
In the newsletter. It's an 8-page newsletter. Yeah.
And you have been religiously doing it every month?
Every month. Every month. You can see it. In fact, anybody listening to this thing, if they go to Parliament website,
yes,
under my name, they will see, if they scroll down, they'll see back copies up to 2019 September.
Okay.
It's there on the website, so they can go and read my propaganda there.
That's good to know. That's good to know. So as presiding officer then, Deputy Speaker of National Assembly, you've seen many bills being passed in Parliament.
Yes.
Talk to us about how a bill becomes law. For someone at home who sees these bills and then they see a law being made, how does a bill become law in South Africa, and your role as a deputy speaker?
All right. Let me take it slightly back. My longest time in Parliament was as chairperson of the committee that dealt with local government. I did serve briefly at the beginning in the Standing Committee on Finance, briefly, and then in the Portfolio Committee on Housing, and one on provincial and local government. I served in those three committees. And then subsequently, I also chaired in 1998 the Reconstruction and Development Portfolio Committee, when Max Sisulu became the chief whip and subsequently later the speaker. But firstly, there has to be a political reasoning an explanation of why a bill is necessary in cabinet. So let's talk about in the area of finance that people who serve in this committee may find that there's a problem here, and we think the solution of this problem is perhaps generating a piece of legislation that will manage the relationships of actors who interface with this body. So that's what that's where the law starts, with a political and or economic reasons, social reasons given for why it is necessary and what changes does it want to bring about. That's a very important part of, for example, today in the cabinet, your bill must be accompanied, if necessary, by a socio-economic impact when implemented. So somebody must have done research to determine, if we were to introduce this legislation, what its likely impact on the environment out there, especially if it's in education. In education, the bill, for example, there would have had to be an assessment of its likely impact. And then it is taken through the process of consultation by members of a committee, like such as the one I chaired, that goes clause by clause. After we have received the necessity for the bill, after we have received after it has been approved in cabinet and via the leader of government business, it is submitted to Parliament. It is then introduced to the committee and in the House, and it is subjected to public consultation. So members of the public must hear, oh, this area of the work you guys are doing, like the creative people in that environment. There is a clause in the Copyright Act which some of them objected to it. So they would raise their objection, and if those objections are found to be substantial, that would lead to the amendment of the Act, as an example. Or members of the committee, this based on political grounds, the ANC and the ANC's view on the matter and its allies, or other political parties and their comments on the law before us, the bill before us. That process of consultation is important, because then at the end of that process, the chairperson introduces the bill to Parliament in the National Assembly and says that this is the report of the committee. We have considered this bill, we have amended it in the following areas, and we propose that the House approve this bill. And then if it is a Section 76 bill, that's one important step. The legal services ask the question, can it go through? Does it affect the provinces? And if it affects the provinces and the work they do, then it's a Section 76 bill. But if it is if it doesn't necessarily affect the provinces in the capacity and the powers and that the Constitution gives them, then it is a Section 75 bill, and it can pass the National Assembly. And once it is passed there, or debated in the House, at the end of the debate, the matter is placed by the presiding officer for debate, for voting, and then we invite political parties to vote on the bill. If it is passed, then it is sent to the Speaker, the Speaker, through her hand, then submits it to the President to sign off. The President, in spite of the fact that all of us, firstly the department from which it comes from, must have checked the legality and the constitutionality before they bring it to us. And when we get it as a committee, we must also make that assessment that it is constitutionally compliant. It violates no constitutional, it doesn't discriminate, for example, against people who are blind and or deaf, as an example. And then, because then it would be violating the Constitution. And then the department would have received the say-so that it's okay, but Parliament must, using its own legal independent responsibility, assess its constitutional compliance. The President has the same duty. This is why sometimes there are bills that he has returned on the grounds that he thinks they don't comply with the Constitution, and provides the reasoning. So it is only when he is satisfied that it is fine that he signs it into law. He was joking the other day on the national health insurance, telling the House and the public that no, this one is going to be signed. I'm just waiting for a pen.
Yes, I remember that. Yes.
Once he does that, then it becomes law.
It becomes law.
Returned to the department that is appropriate, Department of Health, and then they begin to operationalize the bill.
Yes.
It becomes law.
So during your tenure in Parliament, is there a specific piece of legislation that you've worked on and you've passed and you've seen its impact on the lives of people that you can recall? Any legislation or a bill that you think, having passed by Parliament, it really made a huge difference in the lives of our people?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't know how come it never occurred to me to do a deliberate assessment. But for example, I was let me put it this way. I co-chaired the local government negotiating forum. So we designed the process towards the proper democratic local government elections in 3 phases. We introduced the concept of the pre-interim, in which we describe the old government and the new, what we call non-statutory bodies, to serve in some interim, what we call interim transitional local councils. There was a pre-interim phase, an interim phase of those TLCs, and then the final phase. This is the 2000 legislation on local government. But ahead of that legislation, we first had to divide the country into legislation, into municipalities, the geographic boundaries of municipalities. So the amalgamation of different townships, that Botshabelo, where my constituency is, for example, was in quotes no man's place, partly because people went there because some of them were forcibly removed from the farms and other places and so on. And there was an attempt to put it under the Mangope's Bantustan. And then they changed their mind. They wanted to put it under the authority of the Mupedis Bantustan, but people resisted successfully to be located in either of the two. And finally, it has been incorporated into what we now call Mangaung.
Yes.
itself and Tabanj, which is just outside Botshabelo, 40 kilometers from Bloemfontein roughly, which was under Mangope's government, the Bandustan. So that was the division of the townships. So that law of the demarcation law, which came before the local government one, was to demarcate the country into non-racial municipalities with a potential for a sound tax base. If you didn't have it then, that can grow that tax base over time. So those were some of the criteria we used in the Demarcation Act to demarcate the countries into the municipalities that you see them today. The second related thing that needed to be done was to restore the names of those places. That's an arts and culture related stuff, to restore the name. I signed off the names of all municipalities in the Free State. What used to be called Kwakwa is now called Malutia Pofu, because it incorporates Harrismith as part of it. It's Malutia Pofu, which is named after the mountain closest to which that area is. It's called. And Mangaung itself, a place of leopards. So the cultural aspect of transformation were very crucial, important to us. So all of them in the Free State, I'm suggesting that I was the MEC for local government and housing during that period, 2000 to 2004, 99 to 2004. And we signed off on the names of those places. Today they are called those names. So that's the function that I was responsible for doing that. But also let me add, incidentally, all the rules of order in the councils in the Free State were also signed off by me. They were generated during that period when I was MSc there, because they were part of the establishment of the new system. So that you have those places named in that way, and none of them were objected to successfully, if at all. In other words, it means people were accepting, and the process to determine those names was very acceptable too. So from a cultural point of view, we restored the names of those places, so to speak, or gave names to places that came together that used to be separate.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a very important part of that. That's as a result of legislation we passed to transform these places and what they are called. But most important, significantly, is that they must be able to build their own tax base to service constituencies within their own areas and so on. We haven't succeeded, as far as I'm concerned, sufficiently on the what we call spatial justice. Some of these areas in municipalities still stay apart from one another. Most of the people's money is commuting money because of apartheid divisions of their geographic location. We haven't overcome this. So Chapter 8 of the National Development Plan has not yet been fulfilled. And it's an area that is very crucial to the appropriate reconstruction and development of each of these municipalities in the country.
Do you think that the district development model can address some of these disparities?
Maybe I must put it across this way. There has been very many interesting initiatives to bridge those apartheid divisions. I remember approving in the Free State, in a municipality close to Lesotho, an inspired proposition from one of the municipal manager and his team who came to me, which if I approved, which I did, about 1,000 homes to be built in what used to be a buffer zone between town and township. I approved it as one attempt to do that, to close that gap. But also in Johannesburg and its subsequent development since its establishment, there were corridors that were identified by, I think it is Pakstow, and before him, Honourable Masondo, corridors of development, including you see, part of the redefinition of ESCOM, for example, and who it serves. It's an important amendment to the areas in which it could operate. It couldn't operate elsewhere before. But now with the change, it was able to operate in every town, in every area in the country. The difference only being areas where municipalities had authority over that and so on, but otherwise it worked everywhere else. And this is why, I mean, its impact is huge, often understated, that more homes were electrified in the few years that the new dispensation came into place than the previous 100 years of the history of the country. So that opening up and allowing electricity to be supplied to both urban and rural areas, irrespective of who stays there, was a major transformation in legislation and in the role institutions like ESCOM were going to play. But that's absolutely crucial.
I want now to move and to the Constitution.
Mustn't we
take a break?
No, mustn't we talk about, you asked me about legislation that I was involved in. You see, I want to make an example of, okay, the Demarcation Act. No, let me start here. I was appointed by Pravin Gordhan, by Vali Musa, the then Minister of Constitutional and Local Government, to be part of a team chaired by Pravin Gordhan to write the white paper on local government. Mm-hmm. So we produced that white paper. So the design, powers and functions and things of local government flows from that white paper. So I still think that the definition of what we said local government should be in that white paper remains one of the most appropriate vision that remains valid today. Yes. There's no question about it. Of course, I know there are people who will quarrel with me about not that part, but about aspects of the assumptions we made about the sustainability of the financing of local government. I was involved in the thinking through and discussions of some of this legislation before they came to the House, outside and elsewhere, so that when they did finally come in, their implementation has been completely uneven and not with as much passion as we would have loved, but they also created opportunities for wrong things to happen, unfortunately. So there are parts of the system that we designed in the overall that were not successful. I was appointed by Minister then she was Minister of Minerals and Resources, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, to become part of a team that resolved the problems in the housing sector. And before then, as a SANCO representative, I sat in the National Housing Forum that produced the policy positions that came into play subsequently. So when I went to become MEC for local government and housing, coincidentally, I'd been involved in the struggle against the system as it existed before then, and got involved in shaping the policy framework within which the changes were going to take place both in housing and in local government. And when I went to the Free State, none of the officials who worked with me could beat me on those two areas, their policy issues and so on, because I was involved deeply in the formulation of housing policy as well as in the local government systems and so on. So it was an advantage I had, I'm suggesting,
Yes.
in running that portfolio there and so on. Unfortunately, your democratic system is designed such that after 5 years there's no guarantee you come back.
Yes.
Just when I was getting to grips with the operation and implementation of policies in local government and housing, I moved off.
So, given that now,
So it's policy, lawmaking, legislation, and the operational experiences that I've had
yes,
at the founding phases of all three areas.
yes,
And so when I look at them, I often think of them from those three angles.
yes, yeah. So now, given the state of local government now today, and the challenges that local government face, do you think that some of the assumptions that were in the white paper should be revisited to strengthen local government?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think we must find a way to do that, and I think there's agreement to do it. In fact, Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, when she was Minister of COGTA, she initiated a process to review the local government system and so on. But I don't know where that process is now. But it's an important process that was identified for review. Those aspects of the white paper that suggest our assumptions were incorrect, or even if they were correct, but the capacity did not exist as we expected, which is an assumption as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
So the other question I wanted to ask is that in your role as in Parliament, you've been very focused on also supporting institutions, supporting democracy. So we know that our Constitution established many institutions that were supposed to provide checks and balances, you know, and also to serve as guardians of our young democracy. What are your thoughts specifically on the FFC? I want to bring it home to the FFC, because with the FFC, the idea was that the FFC was going to be an institution which takes subjective political decisions out of the division of revenue process. So the FFC will come in as an independent body to make sure that public resources are allocated efficiently without the politics. So in your view now, if we have to look at the mandate of the FFC and how the FFC has matured over the years, 30 years later, have we lived up to those constitutional expectations?
Well, Let me first start by saying that one of the, this is in the overall. Not only has the 6 elections that we are going through the 7th election process, not only were there 6 elections ending at every 5 years being successful, and never once were they credibly objected to. Okay? So that's one huge success of the previous 6 years. The second one is this area that we are talking about. We can't talk about that because that's an element. Elections are an element of a broader democratic process. It's both representative with the elections produce, but it is also participatory. Okay, and this participatory part of this exercise takes different forms. By creating institutions that support democracy, we were thinking that this electoral system and its outcomes will not necessarily be adequate to ensure that what we expected and wanted to see happening will happen. So we need institutional mechanisms for making that assurance. That's how the institutions of democracy constitute what we in Parliament call a complementary activity by institutions that has ability to provide a different perspective when things fall between the cracks in the implementation of the constitutional design and satisfaction of people's needs. There must be structures created to oversee the bureaucracy. So the FFC comes into play there to oversee the public resources in the whole, and not to work necessarily with the assumptions that are made inside government. And it is that role that I think, in my humble opinion, we haven't done sufficiently of in the past. And the problem is in 2 places. Firstly, inside, not everybody who have served inside the government structures at the beginning understood properly what the role of these institutions were and how they were supposed to be worked with. There are those who understood that role but did not agree with it. And so they provided blockages in what otherwise would have been an appropriate acceptance of the recommendations, for example, of the FFC, when it did so, questioning the assumptions of Treasury. I'm just making an example. But of course, there has been very useful work that the FFC has played very significantly in the robust arguments it presented, because that was always a key issue. That if we all agree on evidence-based policy making, then its evaluations must similarly be based on evidence-based. The FFC plays in that space very, very well. And so, okay, let me put an overall question. We often undermine these institutions because, okay, let me not speculate about the reasons behind some of the objections, or if not public objections, but quiet objections with undermining the efficacy of these structures. The first one is the public purse. The budget that you have created, you are given a complex, difficult task, but inadequately supported to do so. So for me, if you ask me, you are just like the Commission on Gender Equality. The work it's supposed to do is absolutely crucial. And if it were to make a big difference, it requires resources to be able to do that and make the biggest impact. Otherwise, it doesn't do adequately what potential it can do. And so my sense is that the 7th Parliament, one of the things it must do, and this one applies to, we have finished almost in many areas of the work, the legacy reports. In other words, I haven't seen where yours will be, but in other words, of the FFC and so on, and what has been put together as a legacy report. But I know that work has been done to summarize some of the highlights of what was left done and what is still to be done going forward. I was telling the current Auditor General that, by the way, you mustn't forget your task we gave you to lead a task team as an institution that supports democracy, to coordinate the discussion around many issues, including the demarcation one. How collaboratively, whether we can collapse some of them or not, and so on. But what came to us, which we agree with, was that the delinking from departments. My impression, you may advise me otherwise, right at the beginning, was that there wasn't a single institution that said no to that idea of delinking. That it was felt, in my view, appropriately that your relation must be with Parliament, so that you don't get entangled in double jeopardy. You have to comment on the work of this department, but it is this department that finances you, as an example. It creates a potential difficulty. And so my sense is that that problem needs to be sorted out. It's an urgent one that must be attended to. But here the delay was on our part in Parliament, and the consultations that we initiated but did not produce the result in time for us to let the parliamentary process take through, because the parliamentary process has not happened. What was happening was ourselves in the Speaker's office overseeing this delegation, to me in this instance, of managing the work of the institutions that support democracy, so that we can implement any of the recommendations that we agreed to, firstly inside the institutions themselves, and then secondly in consultation with the public. But we thought that the public would not have a problem with if people said no, we agree on this arrangement. It's an institutional, organizational design issue that is seen to make effective the work of both. If you were to, for example, let me illustrate this point by pointing out the Pan-South African Language Board, as well as the CRL Commission. Both deal with language. There's no reason why those aspects should not be operated from the same organization and institution. The rest can be designed differently and elsewhere. It was also meant, incidentally, the CRL Commission was an interim structure created to deal with issues that at that time were assuming problematic appearances on the political platform. So it was meant, the rest of the functions were meant to be dealt with elsewhere and so on. So we didn't complete that work, unfortunately. And things that are incomplete assume a life of their own.
Yes.
Absolutely, there's no question about it. I've had comments of people saying that in the last, 4 or so years of your existence as the FFC, the quality of your work has been very sharp, because it is when that work gets added to the subjectiveness, opposition of others, when it is not strong enough, then it weakens your ability to influence the outcomes. But the observation that I had, I told you I would consult a little bit, is that you've been doing, your team here has been producing absolutely sound arguments on that environment, but it has not sorted out the basic problem of which must be taken up at different levels of the legislative status and where you get your finances from. But as a concept, it's an absolutely correct idea that we can't allow that. What we noticed right at the beginning is even more so now, that the public resources and how they are managed needs to be acted on rationally, consistently across the board, and can't be left to only one player. That's my view of the role of FFC. And of course, some of the quality of the arguments that you have posed. For example, the research that you participated in looking at the gender responsive, sensitive budgeting, for me I leave this space I've been in with a little disappointment that we didn't make as much progress as the work suggested. We sent a person from Parliament here, an official, to go and work in SADC Parliamentary Forum. And the SADC Parliamentary Forum produced documentation based on their consultation and discussions of a gender-based responsive budgeting process. But we have not implemented that. So I think it's unfinished business. There's a possibility that we may just be able to do it. I'm hoping that we can make a huge difference, because that approach to the budgeting process for me is one of the most important work that we have cut out for us especially. So those contributions for me were absolutely valuable. I have no doubt about it. It coincided with my own gender sensitivity. I've learned along the way and was taken advantage of by the other structures, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association International, and recently the AU in the discussions of what they called the AU Commission invited me to go and read a declaration of heads of state it was during a men's conference. So they were articulating some of the supportive work required of heads of government, and their declaration constituted an undertaking to do so. They asked me to go and read that thing, and I suspect the reason is because of the work I have been doing on gender-related issues, including closing the gap, supporting the men's forum from the South African National AIDS Council that has been very creative and very working very hard throughout the country in balancing up the battle for gender equality.
Yes.
Yeah, in a big way.
Absolutely. Do you think, Deputy Speaker, that institutions supporting democracy have a role to play in supporting the legislative sector in its oversight and accountability work in terms of deepening democracy?
Absolutely, absolutely. What I said when I said your work is complementary, it's exactly what I mean. In that the evidence that you come up with are matters that, as committees of Parliament, for example, and the legislature, that evidence that we come across in the course of doing our work from the people themselves or from the reading that we make globally to bring to bear on decisions we are making, it would be completely out of order not to have that used in the interest of the people and in the interest of holding accountable the executive. The Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation, no, it's wrong. It's the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, hosted with the President the World Forum of Sciences, academies of sciences around the world, and they produced a declaration they called Science for Social Justice. So my interpretation of that idea is that the calculations, the thinking that you do to support your recommendations you are not getting from your ancestors. There's work that's been done, research that's been conducted, evidence that's there that faces us, that sometimes we ignore or we are not aware of or we misinterpret. So the reason you were created in the first place was precisely to become that conscience, that input into strengthening the parliamentary process to ensure we all collectively do what we agree needs to be done. And if we don't do that, where there are gaps, that we know them and we take action on them. So the evidence you produce is meant to achieve that objective. That's the idea. We still, my humble opinion is that, okay, I, at the moment, chair what is called the South African Parliamentary Institute, and the responsibility for induction of new members and old members, and the management of capacity building initiatives is under this board. So the quality of induction, of explaining to people your roles, is both your responsibility but our responsibility as well. So together, you institutions that support democracy, working with the board to fashion awareness programs for MPs that are effective, that will determine their conduct in the next 5 years. That's why these induction programs are going to be very crucial in working through the induction for new members. That's why, so that we increase appreciation. Not all of us were there like I've been from the beginning. People who are coming are going to be relatively new. They may have read or may read some of the stuff, but we need to improve the quality of induction. This is what happens in every institution. It's not just in this organization. Let me say this. There's a character who's written a book called, or rather, he examines companies and what leads to their death. And he finds that most of the time it is because they depart from the original mission. So over a period of time, there's an erosion of the original objectives, and they don't play any or an adequate role in defining what gets done, so they die. So the work we do here is not going to happen effectively unless we induct the new ones who are coming, not because they are ignorant, but it's also because they must know the relationships that must exist to produce maximum effect for the work they are going to be doing.
Yes.
So that's the idea. It's a really useful relationship building exercise that must have depth if the collective output is going to be good.
So it's important then for the incoming 7th Parliament to be properly inducted by the ISDs themselves as well.
No, you have to play an important role because you see, you have to, it's not just going to be done by you, it has to be done by ourselves who know the system in overall. You know your role in the FFC and its mandate and so on. But we have, our lens is slightly broader in that it looks at the entirety of the system. In your relationship with others, in your relationship with us, and we then have to work with the committees or people who are going to lead the committees, for example, to which you are going to be presenting your material. They need to get assurance from us inside the organization that these relationships are appropriate for our overall agenda. Because if they don't think so, then they are not. If we're just allowed to do it alone, then we won't achieve the goals we want to achieve. It must be done in a manner that recognizes the valuable nature of the role from your view and from our view. Yeah.
The 6th Parliament traversed new and previously uncharted territory, in the sense that there were pieces of legislation that were considered, such as the possible removal of the heads of Chapter 9 institutions, the impeachment of judges, the implementation of the state capture report, and now recently the ruling of the Constitutional Court on the Electoral Amendment Act. Would you say that all these facts point to a maturing democracy, because now we are dealing with more issues that challenge policymakers? It's no longer the bread and butter issues of the early years. 30 years later now, we are actually seeing a democracy now that is at work.
Well, I hope you will find some time to read, if you haven't read it already, a book called Dear Comrade President. That's the title of the book, by Andre Odendal. Andre Odendal provides a view, or the subtitle is that this book is significant for understanding the Constitution. background to the Constitution, because the insights that arise from there are crucial. The design of the Constitution took place following significant amounts of time and years of thinking. Its implementation was never going to be a brief one. So I want to rephrase what you said about the removal of Chapter 9 institution. That's not how we said. We said, in the event we have to remove. Yes, because the court said we don't have those rules, so we can't just do it arbitrarily. Whereas they existed elsewhere, but in this instance they were not there. In other words, the situation had not arisen for us to even consider removing any head of. So, but if it was to happen, the Constitution was clear that we ought to have known that we should have provided that such a thing would happen and what rules would be followed. It was a very good decision. But this is what, architects, I'm told, they put up a building and will not pave the routes until they see where naturally people tend to walk. And they simply formalize that path, that footpath that you've done. Similarly, intellectually, the Constitution maps out a process, and it is only when you begin to walk in that direction that you'll notice. But here it is going to be impossible to cross here without the rules that enables us to do so properly. And so that's the question the point you are raising is that whether that is a sign of maturity. Yes, in the sense that we have now, in the last 30 years, implement sufficient part of the Constitution to open up rooms of which we had not entered yet. Now, after this period, it's been pointed out that here, close these gaps. This the judges. That's a very well. I want to add to you that there wasn't any anticipation necessarily that we would have to ask a president to resign. And the rules also came about in that way, that if you were to do that, how would you do that? The expectation was that every end of 5 years, we would see the need for re-election of a president, not in the middle. Although the Constitution itself, in its formulation, anticipated that and required of us to do certain things, so that when we undertake that job, we do it properly and so on. And so the experiences we have had now have taught us of the value of having those. There are people who challenged whether those rules were appropriate or not, but they have not succeeded so far because they fail to appreciate that. And this is the value. Okay, there's a document which I'll share with you, which was developed in the Speaker's office. It's every constitutional decision that was made, which required and gave Parliament 24 months to do a piece of legislation in one place or another. Because what it does, it points out that, look, this is unconstitutional, so you have to replace it with an appropriate legislation. I think the same issue relates to marriage. Our country is very complex, is very deeply diverse, and the reason the marriage legislation is undergoing changes is to make provision which we do not make when we first formulated it. We just operated on the basis of what I call our bias at that time. So now the reality of our diversity and the recognition of what happens in the absence of some of the provisions being present in the law and those consequences. We have now seen that, and this is where the appropriate wisdom is to redraft that piece of legislation to make it more inclusive. Not only more inclusive, but also equitable in the outcomes in the event this thing collapses as they normally do. Yeah.
So finally, as we close now, you've had a very illustrious career in Parliament. You've made a huge contribution to our democracy, the lives of the people under your leadership as a member of Parliament who has power to make laws. You have really made a huge impact. Going into the future now, what do you see your role now in the context of a changing political and economic landscape into the future? How are you going to continue to impact the lives of our people? Or are you going to write a book or rest or reflect?
All of the above. No, let me first start by acknowledging and thanking the organizations that I serve. The African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, the Civic Movement, of giving me the privilege, with the acceptance of the people, to be a public representative. It's been a privilege indeed. When there were many more talented people than me who were around and available at that time, I was given a responsibility. All this close to 30 years, it's been in leadership positions of committees and of and important roles along the way. So it's been a real privilege. Madiba, when reflecting on the possibility that he might be accused of what is called self-indulgence, when he writes, he says, no, we must write, because when people think about these times, they want to know what our views were, or specifically what roles did we have to play in this thing that is now having its consequences. They must at least have some view of our views that we ourselves have written. That's why we must give that account. When I write, when the times come, it will be to do that, to provide an account of what happens, of the struggles we went through, of the difficulties we went through, but also of the achievements and the valuable lessons we learned, including learning from our own mistakes. So it's going to be an interesting exercise to write. I'm practicing. I've been journaling since 2023 every morning, roughly, writing down 3 pages of my thoughts as they occur to me. It's a practice that I'm doing to practice to play in producing material that others might want to read at the appropriate time.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So that concludes our very, very illuminative, very interesting discussion with the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Honourable Lechesa Tsenoli. I hope that you have learned a lot. I have, and I have been inspired to have selfless leadership, to contribute to our democracy, and to do work that can speak for itself and leave a legacy long after you've gone. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our podcast. See you again.